covering such truths at any and all public events. So for some upcoming events, on Wednesday, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega will be in Love Auditorium at 5 p.m. speaking on the African diaspora and spirituality in the Americas. On Thursday, she will also be giving a talk in Alana NPR at 11:30 a.m. on institution building in Puerto Rico and New York City. And also on Thursday is the second annual 3K run/walk for domestic violence awareness at 4:30 p.m. at Whitnall Field, and all proceeds from the event will be donated to Help Restore Hope Center. And then on Monday is the pre-registration event for Women's Studies at 12 here. And then there's also Social Justice 101 at 6:30 p.m. in Alana. The Social Justice 101 workshop is for those seeking to build a foundational knowledge on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. During the presentation and in the Q&A, please remember to use microphones to ensure accessibility, and remember to clean up around yourselves, and please discard your trash in the trash cans. And if you can please stay and help place the chairs one by one onto the racks following our entrance instructions. Thank you.
Woo! Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone. If you don't know who I am, my name is Odette. I'm the program coordinator here. Thank you to Tenzin for giving us the introduction and some upcoming events that are very exciting. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel for today. This conversation will be moderated by Brenda and Sonia, who's Assistant Professor of Educational Studies. For our other two lovely panelists, Dr. T. Dion Bailey is a U.S. historian whose work exists at the intersection of the late 19th and 20th centuries of African American women's history, Southern social, cultural, and political thought, carceral studies, social injustice, and feminist theory. More specifically, Professor Bailey specializes in the study of Black women and the history of mass incarceration in the American South. She received her master's and PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. After completing a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, Professor Bailey joined the history department at Colgate University as a visiting assistant professor. We're very grateful to have her. Her manuscript project, Daughters of Jim Crow's Injustice, African American Women, Mass Incarceration, and the Business of Black Women's Bodies in the American South, 1890 to 2015, will further expand on her dissertation, which won the 2016 Franklin Riley Prize from the Mississippi Historical Society for the best dissertation on a topic of Mississippi history or biography by placing women at the center of the United States political economy, and illustrates how Southern states shaped their public policies and laws to create a unique system of domestic parole that exploited Black girls and women's labor and sexuality through the prison system. Professor Bailey's work has been featured in articles for BuzzFeed, the Atlanta Journal, and the Clarion Ledger. She has published several articles in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and edited volumes, and is currently working on an encyclopedia entry for Oxford University Press titled Women and the Carceral State, 1900 to 1945. Over the past 3 years, Professor Bailey has developed and ran a nonprofit organization called I Vow, I Am a Voice of Women, that through education, mentoring, support, and empowerment works to aid incarcerated women in their transition from the penal system back into society. So, I'm just overwhelmed. Yes, thank you. We're very excited to have her. To her right, Dr. Dominique C. Hill is thrilled to be back at Colgate teaching in women's studies. Since Colgate, Dr. Hill's teaching, scholarship, and embodied artistry has been dedicated to generating and making legible theories and knowledge produced at the nexus of race and gender through ethnographic, artistic, and embodied mediums and methodologies. Hill's work unearths voices, theories, and practices derived from navigating cultural and educational spaces. In Hill's teaching and scholarship, the body is foregrounded and understood as communicator, representation, and translator of culture, history, and possibility. From over a decade of experience working with Black youth, girls, and women in a myriad of educational and artistic spaces, grew a vested interest in how Black girls and women's bodily experiences can teach us new things and serve as pathways for rethinking theories and practices associated with girlhood, feminism, and justice. Hill is a recipient of the Student Body Selected Distinguished Teaching Award at Amherst College, and Zoe's scholarship has been awarded the Distinguished Dissertation Award for Experimental Qualitative Research at the Intergenerational Congress of Qualitative Inquiry and the Minority Dissertation Fellowship awarded through the American Education Research Association for her book-length project, Black Girl Pedagogies, currently under advanced contract. Dr. Hill, a class of 2015. Dr. Hill, a class of 2005 Educational Studies and Women's Studies double major, received her MS from Miami University of Ohio and her PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Hill is co-visionary of the artist collective Hill L. Waters and co-author of the recently published Who Look at Me, Shifting the Gaze of Education Through Blackness, Queerness, and the Body, which we have copies of in the center. So I'm so grateful to have them here. So please join me in welcoming. I would never do that to you.
Thank you, Odette, the center, interns at the center, the Women's Studies Advisory, and to, of course, my two distinguished colleagues here who invited me to be part of this conversation. And of course, thank you all for coming. Just kind of by process, I want to explain kind of how we're thinking about this conversation. And it wouldn't necessarily be the traditional structure of a lecture. I have a couple of questions that I've posed from both Dr. Hill and Dr. Bailey, who sent me to profoundly engaging pieces that I read over the weekend. And so I have a couple of questions to pose to them from the news and from those pieces. And then I'd like to open it up to everyone to see if there's any questions. And for anyone who's taken classes, who knows that I have too many questions that I can ask if there's a gap of seconds. So I think where I want us to begin with is thinking about the news, right? So 8 days ago when the news of Tatiana Jefferson's shooting happened, I remember seeing a post that was titled, "We aren't focused on why so many Black women die before their time." The piece was in the Washington Post. And as I was preparing to come up to have this conversation with you, both given with what your work does and conversations that you have in your classes, I went back to try and dig up the piece, and it was archived under a new title, and the title was, quote, "I made a vow to always protect my daughters. The Fort Worth shooting makes me question that," end quote. And so I'd like to begin the conversation there, because both your work takes up questions of agency, the ways that Black women, Black girls have carved out a space for themselves politically, even in ways that are not necessarily legible or discussed. So I was just hoping you would think about with us all the slippages that happen with that shift of the archiving, and also maybe speak a little bit to the absence or the hidden reporting of when Black girls and Black women exit the earth too soon.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. In my own personal work and personal experience, I think that, it's important to think about how, right, Black women are sort of marked and sort of castigated by this veil, right? And so we know that historically Black women haven't been considered women, not worthy of any type of justice through, we know that's through slavery and even through present day. And so it's sort of easy, I think, particularly in the media, Black girls and women have sort of been portrayed in a certain way, a certain purview. And so what we see happen is that it takes something, sort of drastic and horrific in this way to then, enter Black women and girls into the conversation, which is tragic, right? We know that this isn't, for every Atatiana, there are hundreds of other Black girls and women who reach, see their death go unnoticed and unwarranted and sort of unforgiven in many ways. And so I think that it's important for us, right, even as me, not just as a scholar, but as a person to understand that. I think we talk about this, I talk about this in class, I think about this in my everyday life, right, that what does it mean to be a Black woman? How did I navigate the world as a Black little girl? Something that I had no language for then, but that I have some form of language for now. And it's a scary thing, right, to understand and to know that I might become a martyr in that way, in a way that's unwarranted, in a way that I don't want to be, right, a martyr. And that so many Black girls and Black women, right, that's say her name, right, that we are often forgotten, right? And it's not that we're not here. I talk about this politics of silence, the culture of dissemblance, and sort of how, there is this sort of purview of us, Black women, Black girls, is dangerous. We're hypersexualized. And so in many ways, it seems that, things that happen to Black girls and Black women might be justified, right? But, in some sort of way. And so I think that starting this conversation, over the last 10, 12 years is important, but it has to be more than that because we're going to continue to see, right? It's not just only tragic what happened, police barging in, not announcing themselves and murdering a young Black woman, but we also have to think about other ways that Black women and girls are policed that then can lead to those type of endings.
I think adding on to what you were saying, Professor Bailey, I think some of the slippages are also around the notion of protection. The question of when was a Black girl and a Black woman ever protected in our society in the United States is a question. So in terms of one, the question of when has that happened, and is that the necessary mode or the necessary conversation that needs to be had around an individual who was protecting themselves or by nature of guarding themselves and the child, I believe the cousin in the house. We can see this also reflected in Baltimore just recently as well. I am now going blank on her name. But again, this idea of sovereignty around the ability to have a body that is sovereign, that I can protect my body, that I can guard my own body, but also that I have the sovereignty in my own home to protect my home and protect the space in which I live and the people that inhabit it, and that I don't even have ownership or governance over that space. I think the other idea that is missed is this after question, the aftermath of protection, of the aftermath of what happened, what to do with this body, what to do with what happened, which connects back to the title. For people who haven't seen this, it's blurred in a particular way to think about how misogynoir, which is in the title, speaks back to particularly anti-Black racist misogyny enacted in the lived experiences of Black women. And so I want to read something, which is a poem from Portia O, who wrote about Rekia Boyd. Does anybody know who Rekia Boyd was? Any show hands? Literal, nobody. So if there's no hands, that means nobody. Okay, couple hands, few hands. So Rekia Boyd was an individual shot by the police in Chicago. And a colleague and friend of mine, Portia O, wrote a poem, and I'm just going to share a couple of lines to also illuminate what misogynoir, how it functions in the lives of Black girls and women. So Portia O says, "Nobody showed up to the march for Rekia. I guess the protesters got tied up. I guess all the Black folk were busy making signs saying, 'Stop killing our Black boys.' We stay unheard, blotted out, buried. 2 million Black girls go missing in Nigeria, and America puts out a hashtag instead of a search party. I guess we are here for playing, for make-believe, pretend proof. How magic trick missing must I become? If a Black girl gets killed by a cop and the killer goes free, does anyone notice? Do you still call it a lynching? Is her rally just a rehearsal? Ain't that why no one shows up?
Thank you for sharing that, for sure. And I think it's you started to think through with us about the title, and I'm thinking back to the summer when the three of us got together to struggle to come through the title. I shouldn't say the three of us. I sat and watched. Thank you, picking titles. Can you just talk to us a little bit about why the title? For folks who might not have engaged Black feminism, definitely not in as deep and rich ways that you've engaged it. Why misogyny, or why the focus on carcerality? And I want to add on to it specifically, Dr. Bailey, in your work, especially tracing that back all the way to Harriet Jacobs, right? So thinking about how the law has never provided a private and safe space for Black children, Black women. So if you can just talk a little bit about the title and particularly why it's important to kind of center misogyny on hypersurveillance and carceralities. Thank you.
So I'll start. Although my interest is not particularly in the trauma or the happenings or the tragic around these conversations, I think it's important to look at what comes out of the trauma. So my interest is more so interested in what are the sort of educative practices and insurgent pedagogies that come out of Black girls and women moving through these carceral spaces, be it schools, be it classroom spaces, be it literal families and communities, be it also the sort of pressings upon bodies. So in a way, Black girls and women's bodies, the question of what distinguishes girlhood from womanhood is a question, right? It's a question that I explore in my classroom. It's a question that I explore in Black girlhood, because in many ways, girls and women's bodies, when Blackness is attached to it, what's the difference? What's the difference when I walk through the space? If I think back to my life as a girl, that experience of hypersurveillance, of not doing too much, don't be too fast, talk this way, don't talk that way, be careful where you move, watch how they're looking at you, like all those particular sorts of things are no different now. The only difference now is that I've actually disciplined my body to move in a particular sort of way. So it's the acknowledgement. And the girls know. They know that as well. So they decide maybe, which is another thing that I take up, is they know when people are surveilling them, and they actively decide that I don't want to partake in how you decide to surveil me. So I'm still going to act up. I'm still going to twerk. Whereas as a woman, I might stop and be like, oh no, they gonna think I'm crazy. So no, I'm not going to do that in class, right? But there are particular sorts of ways that then by nature of being in that girl body, they're teaching us about practices of free, how to get more free, how to be more free. So that hypersurveillance, the misogynoir, because of one, again, going back to this historical understanding of Black bodies, when one, not only were Black women not seen as women, they also weren't seen as human. So then how do we understand that body moving through space? And then thinking about, again, carcerality, I am very much interested. Can you hear me? Oh, my ear went out then, sorry. I think the other part in my work is interested in how the body literally becomes a cell, in terms of how these sort of tropes, how these ideas, how these experiences come to lock a body into what it thinks it needs to be, how it thinks it needs to move, and so it becomes a self-selling. A self-selling in terms of how am I going to show up in the world? How am I going to present myself in a particular sort of way? Is that way acceptable? And then the governing decision is not from an agency perspective, but from a how will the world outside see me? And I hope that they see me in this particular way, rather than this is how I want to be in my body, this is how I want to move in my body. And Black girls teach me that.
Thank you. For me, I think that, in thinking about sort of the historicizing this kind of conversation, is that we have never really seen a moment in our history where Black girls and Black women, particularly those who are victims of the carceral state, mass incarceration, have been given any attention, right? It's some type of conversation that if Black girls or women end up in prison or in jail or in the juvenile detention system, right? That they belong there, that they have done something that sort of marks them to be in these places. And so, I mean, I go back to 1896, right? So we're going way, way back when we think about how Black girls have been treated in this country. And so there's this case, I write on this case, the story rather, and this is a real story of a real person, Olivia Jeffries, right? And sorry, so I write on this young girl, and I want the reason why I'll sort of mark her name for a minute is because this is how history has really treated her. And so she is the youngest person ever in the state of Mississippi to be charged and convicted with manslaughter and imprisoned in the state penitentiary, right? And so same time she was there at 9 years old, there was an 11-year-old, 13-year-old, these are all Black girls, 13-year-old, 17-year-old, and then there was an 89-year-old woman, right? And so we have to understand, thinking about one coming post-slavery, how Southern states, people in the South, people across the United States and even in the world viewed Black girls, right? There is no distinction. We see that clearly. There was no distinction between Black girl or a Black woman, and she was treated as what they called her was a young Negro murderess, right? And so the state, right, sort of saw fit for her to be incarcerated in a penitentiary that is built and constructed as a plantation, right? It's Parchment Peanut Farm, 30,000 acres. So she's then placed there, and her labor is extracted, right? She's exploited sexually, physically, mentally. And so we have to think about those histories and how that legacy does not, mass incarceration isn't something new. It didn't start in the 1980s with the war on drugs, right? We see an uprising, right, of Black girls and women, even Black men incarcerated in this country, but we know that this is happening prior to this. And so I think that when you have that legacy and now that is marked on your body, right, you're viewed as dangerous, the dangerous class, then that means anything that you do, you're watched and surveilled, right? And there is no way to get out of that. And so I often ask in class or when I'm, giving lectures, I often ask people to think about a time when you were surveilled as a little kid, right? And if you can't imagine it, if you can't think of a time, then it's important to acknowledge that then it must be traumatic to then understand someone navigating this world under that type of surveillance, and that surveillance doesn't stop, right? As a little girl, I was taught to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, don't do this, don't talk loud, right? Sort of how it was constructed from my grandmothers, right, who had experienced trauma, who had been tortured in a way in the South that I don't think that they even fully understood, whose grandparents were slaves, right? And so there's all, for me, carcerality, again, I think I was mentioning this yesterday in class, it doesn't just mean physical bars, it's mental bars, right? There are a lot of ways that even myself, I have to acknowledge that I feel that very present in my life every day, right? Even how I navigate on this campus, right, with my gimp leg, right? So I'm not navigating much, but I do think about that, right? And how I'm, the perception that I give off, right? And sort of, and that's that surveillance because you always feel that you're surveilled, right, in some kind of way. So I think that's the lasting sort of legacy when we think about it historically and then thinking about the ways in which these sort of ideas and realities are shaped from particularly young girl's birth, like Black girl's birth.
Adding to that, thinking about the legacies, the sort of historical legacies that you bring up, I think about also modern day and contemporary educational spaces around policy. So there's a way in which Black girls, the primary reasons that Black girls get suspended are around issues of truancy, absence from schools, deviant behavior, or defiance, right? So again, still wrapped up in the body, still wrapped up in how my blackness does my head and neck switch different than somebody else's body, right? There are particular ways that also girls are also being suspended or being punished by nature again of their body. So there, over the last 7 years, there's been a host of suspensions, expels, connected to girls being suspended for their hair. Right, one girl, Lamia Camion, gets her braid cut out by her teacher. Right, teacher walks up to her and cuts her braid off because she been flicking her beads too much. Right, teacher gets what? What you think happened? $175 fine. Her braid is gone. Her beads are gone. Her pride is gone, her frustration is gone, and then the continual. So the carcerality, whether it's behind bars or not behind bars, it's also this cumulative effect, right? It's the cumulative sort of ongoing, consistent. I'm going to keep looking at you. I'm going to keep policing you. I'm going to keep punishing you. I'm going to keep doing it to you until you start to do it yourself. So until you start to do it yourself. So you don't want to do it anymore. You don't want that trouble anymore. So you know what? I'm not gonna wear this popping lipstick no more. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna keep it blushed. I'm gonna keep it plain. I'm not gonna wear my hair like this anymore because you know what? I don't want that drama. And so there are ways that we can see this sort of history mapping itself into the way particular bodies are misread in schools, and also the punishment or lack thereof from people who decide that they want to take the will into their own hands about what to do with girls in schools.
And I think I want to add to that on the relentlessness, right? So it's not that the discipline leads to an end, right? So the excess of what it means to be in a particular body. I have a couple more questions, but is there anyone who has a question that you'd want to engage on this page?
You put your hand up.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask you to talk to us about in hypervisibility of Black girls and women and invisibility, right? So because I feel like there are two things at work at the same time. On a space like this campus, I feel like cameras on the helmet. A place like this campus, Black women say to me all the time, nobody sees me, and they feel invisible. But then at the same time, you're saying that, we're hypervisible. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to ask you if you can use the word surveillance to talk about what Black parents do to keep their children, in order. And then what society does to then, tamp them down. Because as a Black parent, I sort of feel like what I do is not surveillance, it's survival. Mm-hmm. But you're calling it surveillance. And yeah, because you're saying, your grandma saying, don't talk that way, don't do this, you can't walk on the street with a play gun, or you can't, these are things I say to my boys, but I don't know if maybe that's surveillance, or maybe it's not. It's not.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the surveillance aspect and survival. I think that those lessons that I was learning from my grandmother and the lessons that you're teaching your son, right? That's survival mode. But to understand that when we get out of your presence or my grandmother's presence, that I was going to be surveilled, right? And so teaching those things, right? Teaching these kind of ways in which to navigate the world is a form of surveillance. A form of survival because the understanding of, right, being surveillance, right, to be being surveilled. And just the other night, right, I was coming back from Syracuse. I had a friend come in. I needed a haircut. So some of you saw me a couple weeks ago. I was wild, right? We talking about hair. And so we go up to Syracuse, right? We're coming back in Cazenovia, right? Like, we're just driving. And we, out of the blue, are pulled over, right? And so my first thought was to call someone, to have someone on the phone, and so that they can hear the transfer, and I've been taught, like, put your hands on the steering wheel, and don't make any subtle movements, because you're going to be surveilled. And that's exactly what happened, right, when this officer came to the car. Flashlights, asking a million questions. Where are you from? Why are you here? What are you doing out this late at night? there's a million Target bags in my back seat. And I'm saying, I can't, like, whose car is this? Who is it registered to? All these questions. So I'm trying to lift my leg up. I'm like, I can't drive. My friend is driving because there was a concern about, well, your registration, this isn't the name, right? And so this is something that took 30 minutes in the middle of it was dark, it's 11 o'clock at night, and you don't know if you're going to get out, right? And so I'm taking those lessons and then just watching TV and seeing what happens in those type of situations, right? What could escalate, right? And so I think for me, I always feel that sort of sense of surveillance, right? And then this idea of not being seen and seen, on a campus such as this is it's one thing where you can say there's not a lot of people that look like me, right? So I'm not seen. And at the same time, you can feel because of that, people are watching you, right? I feel, and I have some of my students in here in class, and sometimes I have felt, not just here, but other places, that my own students who I work to create a form of community with, an open classroom, that I'm being surveilled by them as well, right? And it's not intentional. I don't think it's intentional, but I think that's sort of the reality of being, right, Black, being a Black woman, and experiencing these, because it is trauma, right? Whenever you have to navigate a world in a certain way that others don't, that is traumatic. And it's how we deal with that and cope with that. But then I wonder, why is it that there are these burdens placed on me because of my, Blackness, in a place where, it shouldn't, right? I don't feel that it should happen. And so, I just think that thinking historically, for me, that's sort of the difference, I guess, between being surveilled and then this mode of survival. Because I often feel that we're all trying to survive in one way or the other, right? It's just, what tools have you been given to tell you to help you survive? And our tools are different. Some people are just told, you grow up, go to school, you'll get a good job, and that's how you survive, right? But my friend who has a little boy, and he really wants to be a police officer for Halloween, and she, like, it's strange, right? It's fine, but then she's having to tell him why he can't be a police officer and have a toy gun. And he's thinking, he doesn't understand it. He's 11. He has no clue. He just can't comprehend why that is something that he shouldn't be, right? Because someone might mistake, say you have it's a phone, right? We hear these stories of someone reaching for a cell phone and then police murdering them, saying it was a gun. So these are the type of conversations that some people don't have to have, but when in some families you must have them. And that's sort of,
Yeah, that takes me back to childhood. I think to the point, I'm gonna go back to Black girls because Black girls always teach me. Like, that's my work with Black girls always remind me, no matter how far, radical I think I am, they always get me together. And so I think one of the things is the conversation around surveillance, policing, and survival. I think that surveillance is something that comes down over you. I mean, there's folks always watching. I think that when I look at what I learned in my childhood, or what I learned from my mother, were modes of survival. But I think when I listen to Black girls and them talk about their lives, some of those practices can become policing because there are no other forms of free to practice. Like, there is only one way to be. So when I think about the qualms were, well, my mom taught me that was the only way to be a woman. My mom taught me that was the only way to show up in my body. My mom taught me that if it's the only one, then I feel like it becomes a policing, which is like, if you get anywhere out of that frame, then that's problematic. But I feel like as parents, I would imagine offering different sorts of opportunities, that isn't always the case. And so I think about that as survival. Like those rules or codes of this is how you need to be for this particular thing. I also think about the importance of um, of conversation connected to the teaching. Like I think about all the lessons that I've learned and that I've gained from my parent, from my family. That it wasn't until going back and thinking about my own life that I was like, oh, well, this is what they were probably trying to teach me. Or then having a conversation because I came from a family that was like, do as I do as I say, not as I do. Which was also like a thing, which is like, okay, well, what I'm supposed to be. I mean, I can see very clearly what you're doing, but what you're telling me is not adding up. So I think that is one thing for me when it comes to the girls, that the distinctions are the distinctions are rooted in, are there other opportunities for me to show up differently? Are there other lessons that allow me to learn that lesson around the importance and more? Is there space for me to actually inhabit my body differently than the rules or regulations in which I need to go out into the world in? Um, and then by nature of that, that becomes a mode of survival. So when I again go into the girls, it becomes important that they know that that isn't the only way for them to be. Because after a while, for example, code switching no longer becomes code switching. It becomes you inhabiting a mask that you no longer realize you have on. You don't take it off. So then, okay, is it code switching? Because I'm actually not switching anymore. I'm just talking like this, and everybody feels comfortable, and I don't even realize this is not the way I'm doing things anymore, right? So there's just these things that start to happen, and so when I look at the girls, they start talking about, I'm at this private school now. I speak in this particular sort of way because my teachers hear me in this way, and I want them to know that when they come to me, they can stop talking like that. That is a switch. Move in and out. Move in and out for protection, for safety, for these things. Thinking about visibility and hyper visibility, I also think visibility is more about, it's also more than just a vision or a scene. It's also a recognition. So when I think about Moya Bailey's work around misogynoir, who coined that word, there's a real way in which Moya's name is not even recognized anymore in relationship to misogynoir, or Trudy, who does the work alongside Moya. So there's a way that there's this complete erasure. There's a way that we use the word intersectionality, which is a framework, and people don't know Kimberly Crenshaw. There's a way that we do this work in problematic, ways where visibility is also, again, the recognition. So we can hear the term, but there's no visibility no visibility as in recognition for who offered us that insight, who offered us that lesson. So the hypervisibility becomes related to that, becomes a thing where I see you when you're doing something wrong. When you're just being, I don't see you. So the visibility, the hypervisibility and invisibility happen simultaneously.
As we get another question, we have questions? I think one of the ways also to think about it in this campus, I often have thought about how certain people's absences or presences are marked. And I often have conversations like, I'm really tired, I want to miss this thing, but it'll be obvious that I won't be there, right? And so thinking about that, especially surrounding my students, right? So how do I deal with people's absences, which I oftentimes then think creatively how to think about that, right? Because there's students who can be kind of invisible in a talk, but if particular people are there or not there, there's a way that stands out. And at what point is there a burden that is being placed on those particular people to consistently show up and be present and do particular kinds of work? Do we have other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. I'm very moved by what you're saying. I'm also thinking about my daughter as a South Asian woman. My husband's African American, so I have no experience raising a black girl or half black, however you want to say it. Think about it in this country. So what you're saying makes me anxious and also think about these things. So thank you for that. But my question is to ask you to talk a little bit about how Black Lives Matter has changed has it changed some of this? The fact that there's a black leadership. How has it brought attention particularly to women and the murder of Black women and the impact it's had, just to kind of historicize a little bit of what Black Lives Matter has meant? If you can, thank you.
Thank you. So I'll say, has it done work? Sure. But I think part of the sort of articulation of Say Her Name came out of the fact that in the Black Lives Matter movement, a number of stories, narratives, realities were kind of being left out. So on the one hand, and also in terms of Black Lives Matter, the sort of historical, so we can say it was created by 3 Black women, all at least 2 of whom were queer. Were all 3 were queer? Okay, well here we go. Right, so all 3 were queer, right? 3 queer Black women, but the recognition of them and their actual work in that movement has almost been evaporated. Like, people have literally pulled that out. And so again, not even remembering those names. So there are ways that, again, thinking about this sort of historical arc of what does race do when it collapses onto gender, onto a Black woman's body, or onto a Black girl's body. It does very, very interesting things, which is why misogynoir becomes super important. So there's this, we can think about it in education in terms of, one, before 2008, we didn't even disaggregate data along race and gender lines. We only looked at it from race or gender. In that narrative, completely Black girls were evaporated. They were either clumped into racial realities or gender realities, which then told a very different narrative around their actual experiences. When that data was actually disaggregated in 2008 for the first time by the Association of University Women, you saw that, in fact, whereas education was toting a gender line and that there were gender disparities, what you saw was that actually in racialized groups, their achievement was actually located along racial lines closer than it was gender lines. The actual biggest gap was between white boys and white girls, the largest disparity, which was like 25 points of difference. Everybody else toted the totem pole, race and gender together. So we see these ways that these movements, by nature of what the uniqueness of race and gender does is it collapses a conversation. And we also see that in relationship to violence. So we see this conversation where everybody can name us, everybody in here knows Trayvon Martin. Everybody, like, we can name particular sorts of names, but we don't know Rekia Boyd. We don't know, we don't know a host of names. And we can't readily recall them. And sometimes myself, I have to literally say their name, which is why that sort of marking becomes super important.
So would you say Black Lives Matter continued the invisibility?
I don't think it continued the invisibility. I think that the sort of structures that continue to erase and continue to clump did not take a full it did the same thing that it always does, right? Which is that these 3 Black queer women created this movement in the name of all Black lives that were being lost and all Black lives that were being taken away too soon. And yet we then took the movement, we made it something other than what it was started to be.
Thank you. I was just sitting here thinking, about, particularly when we think about race, right? If we think about Black Lives Matter, but we can go back, right? We can think about how it's always been sort of, and this is where we get into these sort of racial politics, right? That particularly with African Americans has always been focused on race first and then gender second, right? And so we gotta fix the race stuff and then we can get to gender. Right, so during Jim Crow, right, same thing, right? Black women were being lynched, but if it wasn't for Ida B. Wells, we wouldn't know that because most people were thinking about Black men being lynched. You think about civil rights movement, right? It was, if we think about the movement today, and most people in high school, and even just most people think that Black men were the leaders and the saviors, right, of the civil rights movement, but we know women, Black women, right, were really the ones on the ground, right, actually putting in the work, starting the movement. But, during Black Power, right, the same thing happened. And so it's always Black women have to take a back seat, continuing on that silence. That's within race, right? And so I often do this activity at the beginning of class, in the beginning of the semester. I say, okay, if we're all in this class together and someone comes by and says, there's one issue, right? There's 4 or 5 issues, but you have to pick one and join in today, right? That's all you can do. You can only choose one. And it has to sort of some kind of way maybe relate to you, right? And so there's people that are going to come by, it's a gender, right? So are you going to choose gender? You're going to choose race. You're going to choose class. You might choose culture. Maybe someone comes by and says there's issues around disability, right? That's something that even I think about now, right? And that's just being totally honest, right? And so what issue, what are you going to, and so with knowing that you understand that something's going to get left behind, right? And oftentimes Black women have been told, you have to deal with race, join this, we have to end racism, and then we'll get to the gender stuff and it never happens. And so, we come out of this, that's where we think about, Black feminism, womanism, right? It comes out of this sense of understanding that no one's ever coming back for us. We do all this work, all this lead work. We're helping everyone, thinking it's a collective and thinking that helping get everyone free will some type of way get us free. And then we find that we're never free, right? But we're doing the lead work. We're voting, right? We're raising children, right? We're serving on boards at churches, school, right? Doing all these things to get free, this idea, and thinking that a movement is some kind of way going to include us and think about us in their policies and their everyday sort of actions, to then face the reality. And sometimes we even know, right, that they're never coming back to us. But in this idea of survival, we have to do it. When you're thinking about extinction and survival, sometimes you're willing to sacrifice yourself and your own well-being, hoping that it'll be better for others, right? And so, I think that that's a real reality, that even when I think about Black Lives Matter, and again, when we think say her name, it's one thing to say her name, but have you looked up the pictures? Have you said these are real people? Trayvon Martin, he was on CNN. I'm not taking away from that, right? But do we give the same type of sort of currency, right, to Black girls and Black women? We just don't, right? We get around something that we think we can modernize, right? And then we stick to that. But right, even me, I think about Sandra Bland. I went out to Houston. I went to the spot that she was at, right? When she's pulled over by a police officer, trying to get some clarification and understanding for myself, how being pulled over, right, can lead to someone's death. And then hence my fear every time a police officer pulls me over, because that's a reality, right? So I never think it's going to come and say, oh, you have a warning. No, this is just a warning, right? And so I think that, when we think about that, these movements, they aren't necessarily erasing us or not. It's just no one cares enough to have us in the conversation.
That also connects back to your stuff around the business of Black women's bodies, right? In terms of the production and the labor that is done on the backs of Black women's and girls' bodies. So connecting to they're never coming back to get us, it's also that there are parts of other people's identities that are not on the line, right? So in the sense that, the Combahee River Collective said, basically all oppression is connected. There are interlocking systems of oppression. And once you help Black women get free, everybody else will be free. Why? Because in the structure of our society, Black women are at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of race, at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of gender, at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of class, like all of those things. So if you touch and if you get us together, everybody else will be together. But the idea again is that when you have dominant and non-dominant, at least one dominant and non-dominant identity, you don't need to save all of yourself, but we're trying to save all of ourselves, like our full selves, and so that becomes this this complicated marker of what are we doing?
What are we doing? And I think that it's also that it's profoundly historical. We can see it repeating itself in very particular ways. And I was thinking about how almost every semester I have that conversation with students and like kind of, well, I didn't know that Rosa Parks wasn't tired while she sat down, right? As if it's always emotional. Of course, it's emotional, it's effective labor, but it's also strategic, right? So we think about when we make sense of what movement making looks like, when we think about multiple times in history, we can think about the women who led particular historical movements that many of us who study those women, right? So I'm thinking about, I do work surrounding Lorraine Hansberry, and thinking about the African airlift movement, and thinking about some of the women that you mentioned, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to my question just so quick. And thinking about I'm kind of positioning this to my last question to you before I can open it to one more question. We can continue the conversation.
Can I hear you, Professor Sun?
Thank you. All right, closer, better? Okay. So I'm thinking about it in relationship to two pieces. So I have this kind of, to the left side of my desk, there's a method to the madness, which sometimes doesn't look like there's a copy of But Some of Us Are Brave. And every once in a while I'll be having kind of this rough day and I'll kind of lean back in my chair and look at it right there. And the longer title is all the
women are white.
all the women are white and all the blacks are and all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave, right?
Yeah.
So the idea kind of tracing back to Gloria Hall and the women of comedy and thinking about how that, those things can't be separated. I wanted to hopefully give you both a chance to talk a little bit about your own scholarship trajectory in whatever ways that you might want to, and thinking about, so students keep asking, how did you end up doing this? Why are you at Colgate? And what do these things mean? And, how did you end up here? And why do you show up in particular ways? Or how can you do a particular kind of research? And for me, it's always the fact that I didn't have to, I studied under the tutelage of people who didn't require me to prove that racism and sexism were a problem. They were just like, okay, now show us how, as opposed to starting off where so many people start, where they have to prove that it is a problem before they actually get to their studies. So I wanted to acknowledge the wonderfulness of having you both on campus as interlocutors, but also hopefully sharing with many of the wonderful students I've gotten to know in this room about what some of your trajectories were.
Now we don't have time. 5 seconds. And we can go. And what classes am I teaching this semester?
Oh,
Take their classes.
yes. I can start there easily first. I am teaching a class on the politics of Black girlhood. This course is interested in thinking about the relationship between Black feminism and girlhood, trying to create this story that we talked about, this sort of arc between girlhood and womanhood. In women's studies, there's the newer area of girl studies that is often very white. I mean, the conversation, they don't necessarily take up issues of race or issues of complexities around, per se, girlhood and womanhood, not as age fixed, if that makes sense. But again, as we've talked in this conversation today around the complexities around race and gender as it relates to girls and women, it's taking up that conversation. So trying to explore girlhood as a political practice, girlhood as a site of freedom seeking, girlhood as an insurgent space. So that class. So if you want to learn about hip hop feminism, you want to learn about girlhood, you want to explore your own womanhood, whatever you want to do, want to come talk to me, just come take class. Trajectory. Currently, so one of the things my previous colleague said to me, which I love that quote, so I'll say it again. Racism is like gravity. Show me you can fly, which is very similar to Professor Stein's statement. And so my work is very much interested in not denying the reality of what happens with race and gender, not denying hypervisibility, not denying surveillance or policing, but to really think about if we look at girls on their own terms, and if we look at girlhood and women on their own terms, what can we actually see? What becomes more legible when we aren't looking through a problem or a pathology lens? What can we see in their bodies that they teach us? So we think about, I'm currently writing a piece on um, a case which looks at Maya and Deanna Cook out of Massachusetts, who were suspended for their hair. And we're talking about really the politics of what did it mean to discover their own sensibilities of culture, being two twins who were adopted by white parents, right? And so they were exploring their hair. They wanted to make these intentional decisions. And then here they come to school, and the school is like, no, you need to stop doing this, to the point where they were taken off their bus on the way to a track meet. Like, I can't even get to my track meet. You won't let me finish, to suspend me because my hair was braided in extensions. And you are surveilling other Black kids in class, asking them, is their hair real or fake? Now, we all know Black folk are not the only people that wear extensions. But the point was, again, this particular marking of race and gender does that. And so what I'm starting to look at now is, one, how do Black girls function as a site of queerness? How do Black girls' bodies teach us complex things around gender and around sexuality? And the last thing I'll leave with is, a Black girl said to us when we had a conversation about pronouns, after we talked about what pronouns were, they said, well, just call me my name. And so one of the practices that I use in my class, even though my students be upset, is we use the pronoun Zoe in class to start to think about what does it mean to actually neutralize rather than just gender neutral, or to say a pronoun, which still requires somebody to acknowledge a pronoun. But what does it mean to use our name as a pronoun, right? What a novel idea.
Oh, I was trying to hurry up.
No, we have time.
Trajectory. So in my studies, I've always been, it's kind of cyclical. So I was very much interested in Black girls' experiences in educational classrooms. That came from a personal place as someone who really loved school, but was also always kind of singled out for my mouth for things that Black girls are often singled out for. You know, and my mouth really was, I had questions. Why are you telling me that, Africa, that, people didn't start in Africa? Or why are you telling me this? Or why are you criticizing students for this? So that trajectory sent me into wanting to look at politics of de facto policies in terms of the ways that bodies are read, misread in schools by teachers and by authority figures, which took me into studying at University of Illinois and working with a space called Soul Hot, Saving Our Lives, Hear Our Truths. That space was an artistic-based space dedicated to freedom-seeking spaces for Black girls. It was an intergenerational space in which, as a woman, it was not a mentor model. So women were not seen as the ones that had it all. We were actually seen to be the students. So one, you could never shush a Black girl. Never that. If you want to look up Soul Hot, you can also look up We Levitate on SoundCloud. So some of the things that we did was we sounded Black feminism. So we created actual mixtapes to articulate particular issues such as misogynoir, racism, to then think about, how does Black feminism sound? How does girlhood sound? How does struggling and insurgency sound? So that space of coming to that and learning about how do you move with girls, how do you actually create improvisational curriculum as opposed to prescriptive curriculum, is where my work comes. So in my classes, I have people move, I have people think about things that they do not want to think about. But part of that work is, again, what does it mean to live and inhabit and move through this knowledge? What does it mean to create it and move it through your body? And so that's kind of the trajectory that got me here.
Thank you. So my trajectory, and just to be honest, is just the history that my family has with incarceration, and mass incarceration. And I have an uncle who is serving a life sentence, and who received the death penalty, but then they commuted that, and it's now a life sentence. And my mother, who was arrested. She was first arrested, I think, when she was 19, and sort of how that then sort of shaped her life until she passed away at the age of 38. And till right, sort of my own sort of acknowledgement and dealings with that, and sort of how to give her a voice, right? I never got to ask her about her life experiences and her experiences and with the prison system and the criminal and justice system, right? And so it started sort of just thinking about that, and then just researching. I was working on an oral history project, and I met this African American woman who in the 60s she told me a story of how she went to the doctor on 2 separate occasions, and they sort of induced her labor. The first time she was 3 months pregnant, and the second time she was 5 months pregnant, and she said the doctors forced me to have an abortion. And what we figured out was that they induced her labor because the hospital, all African Americans had to be treated outside, right, in tents that couldn't go into the hospital. And so in this whole conversation, she begins to then tell me about raising her daughter, which this woman was 84, and so her daughter was 10. So I was kind of confused, right? I understood, but then she's telling me that both her daughter and granddaughter, which this was her great granddaughter, were in and out of prison, and she was saying things like, they're just bad women. I didn't raise them that way. And so it made me sort of connect to my own personal history and thinking about those kind of politics, right? And these kind of conversations and just thinking this through. And so that's really what sort of led me down my trajectory, is really to pay homage to my mother and my grandmothers. My grandmother owned juke joints. So if you're in the South, you've heard of juke joints. She owned 2 of them, little cafes, and she was robbed one night, shot in the stomach. And, sort of this idea of how forgiving she was, right? And then she was arrested for running the juke joint, right? They said she was improper, like she was illegally selling alcohol. So she was arrested while she was in the hospital, right? And so these are the legacies, right? These are sort of the things that I think about and wanting to give voice to those who have sort of been silenced in this way. And my grandmother never talked to us about this, right? And I think I've been told 6 months later, she was feeding the man that robbed her and shot her in the stomach, right? And so part of me, right, that's sort of who I am, right? So I have a nonprofit that works to, to help women and girls, Black girls, transition out of the carceral state. It's me working so hard to try to repay and my grandmother and my mother, right, who are both not living, but in a way of kind of paying homage to them. And so that's really where my research and sort of who I am began. And that's just where it takes me, right? I'm always trying to give voice to those who are not, it's sort of when we say silence, they're there, no one cares to hear them, right? No one's paying attention to them. So that's really my work, right? Whether it's thinking about incarceration or it's thinking about Black girls, Black girlhood, anyone who feels that, sort of they're downtrodden, they're beaten down, right? I try to work to help them, and give them a voice in some kind of way or help them push their voice out. So in the spring, I'm teaching 3 courses. One, an African American history course. This is 1870 or post-Civil War to present. Then I'm teaching a class on African American women, so African American women's history course. And then I tried to throw in the sexual politics of hip hop, but historians aren't that savvy. Like they didn't want me to do that. Okay, so they said I could, but they needed to understand how it was history. It's history. But anyway, I didn't fight that battle. Maybe later, right? So that's why we have AFAM Women's History. But when you get in class, if you take the class, we might be doing something different. Okay, so that's my way of saying that. Okay, and then I'm teaching a history workshop where it's a 200 level, I think, and we're looking through the lens of mass incarceration, and we're going to look at understand, break down the history of mass incarceration, particularly looking at Black girls and women. And then we're going to work on you working on your own sort of iteration of that, right? With the research paper. So those are the 3 classes.
Thank you so much. Will you be here for a few minutes if it's lunch chat? Okay. They will be here. Thank you so much. Can we please give them a round?
Thank you so much. Please make sure to clean up around yourselves. Oops, sorry.
I'm so mad that I'm not here in the freaking spring. I'm so mad. I'll just treat you Or you
like this. And then how you